Welcome to another episode of the GayBarchives show, where we explore gay history one bar at a time. I'm your host, Art Smith, and our guest today, Dr. Brice Smith, is a social entrepreneur and historian. He wrote Lou Sullivan, Daring to be a Man Among Men, a Lambda Literary Award finalist that will be released as an audiobook later this year. Dr. Smith also recently launched the historic multimedia all-weather walking tour app, LGBT MilWALKee, which is free to download in the App Store and Google Play. Welcome to the show, Brice.
No, thank you. It's great to be here with you.
It's great to have you here too. I started this project a couple years ago, and one of the first areas that I really started to find information about gay history was the Milwaukee area, which, of course, to me was very surprising because, being an East Coaster almost all of my life, born just outside of New York City and still living in Florida, Milwaukee was not a place that I would have expected to be particularly rich in gay history. But thanks in part to your friend, your buddy Michael Takash, and the Milwaukee or the Wisconsin LGBT History Project, there's a ton of information that's been recorded. So it's pretty amazing. And now I understand. I'm sorry?
I agree. It's incredible the wealth of history that's available on Milwaukee, and we actually have a long history of recording our history, going back to the gay liberation movement and our organization, Gay People's Union. The leaders of the organization, Eldon Murray and Alan Hess, and others, they really understood the value and importance of history, of being able to show that, we've always been around, to be able to share our stories, to let folks find others with whom they could identify in the past and find inspiration in their stories. And, it's incredible. I feel like, we've both made some really good history here, but also just the amount of history that we've recorded over the decades has been fantastic. And yes, I agree with you. Owed in large part to the Wisconsin LGBTQ History Project.
Yeah, Don Schwam and Michael Takash. Now, let's start with a little bit of your Milwaukee history. How long have you been in Milwaukee?
Yeah, great question. I moved here in 2002. And there actually aren't many of us who move to Milwaukee and make it home. Folks like to joke that oftentimes people leave Milwaukee, but I love it here. I came here for graduate school. Several years or a number of years later, I transitioned, and as I was assigned female at birth, and I was able to transition here, find a wonderful community, and this just became a place where I was able to have all my dreams come true, to have the kind of life that I always dreamed of. And as I was mentioning earlier, about the value of history, it was in history that I came to understand my own identity as a trans man. It was actually through researching and learning about a Milwaukee native, Lou Sullivan, who's now a well-known trans activist. He unfortunately died decades ago, back in 1991. Unfortunately, succumbing to the AIDS virus. But it was, through my research into him that I was able to, to really identify my own identity. And then over the years, I fell in love not only with his history and his story, but the history here in Milwaukee as well. And just as, I wanted to get back to the city. So I've done so first through my research into Lou Sullivan and publishing his biography, also through the Milwaukee Transgender Oral History Project, which is available online. And then most recently, this app that we've created called LGBT MilWALKee, but it's intentionally spelled incorrectly, spelled MilWalkee. We put the walk in Milwaukee.
So you mentioned your book, your research about Lou Sullivan, and the book is called Lou Sullivan, Daring to be a Man Among Men. And that is being released. It's a Lambda Literary Award finalist, and it's going to be released later this year as an audiobook. So that must be pretty exciting you move to a new city, you transition yourself, and then you research a historical figure and write a book about him, and obviously I'm assuming his transition and his life as a man. So that's coming out later this year. And then you also have this incredible app, which it's free to download on the Apple App Store and Google Play. And you have referred to it as a historic multimedia all-weather walking tour app. I'm not sure where the all-weather comes in. I mean, I know Milwaukee is not known for having the greatest weather in the world.
Well, that's why we got to think about things like this. So what we mean by that is with the app, you can either use it to go on physical walking tours to visit sites in person, or you can also enjoy the tours, from the warmth of your couch if it is a cold, snowy day. Because we intentionally created what I call mini documentaries for each of our sites. Each of our sites we've identified, at least at this point, for our initial launch. So you can watch these mini documentaries. It was important to me not only because of the weather, I like to joke about that now, but also to allow people to experience history. I feel like that's really important. So we basically put together these 2 to 3 minute videos that tell a story about the particular location. And we use these sites to basically help share the history of local LGBTQ people, events, organizations, and also the places themselves. So then in watching the video, you can see the pictures from the time, the people involved, and it feels like more of an experience in ways in which other walking tours don't necessarily provide that. Like they may have some narration of the facts that they're sharing, a couple of pictures, but we really put a lot of effort into creating these wonderful mini documentaries. And I say we because I recruited several openly LGBTQ members of Milwaukee community to help develop this app. So we've got Michael Takash, who is our researcher. And then we've got Amy Geronimi, who is our narrator. She's a professional voiceover actor. And then Ashley Altadonna, who is our videographer, and really helped to create the look of the videos. And then from there, the look that she gave us there really helped inspire what we made the app itself look like. And then Robert McCarthy, who led the development team in actually creating both the app and the corresponding website. And I guess, how do I describe my role? Now I'm describing myself as executive director. I guess I was the creator, the writer. So I wrote the scripts for all the mini documentaries, the fundraiser, kind of the manager of everything, and definitely the worrier. I was the one who was worrying about ensuring that we could raise enough, that we could put this together quickly enough to release it for Pride Month, etc.
So I've been doing a lot of research on the history of gay bars all over the place, all over the country, mostly, some international, but mostly in the U.S. And I've uncovered information about a couple of thousand gay bars that no longer exist in our country, and there are many more. some friends of mine are releasing a book, I think this fall, about the gay history of Chicago. That book alone, just dealing with one city, has uncovered 1,001 places in Chicago that have a place in gay history, either as a bar or a safe haven or a refuge or a church or something that was connected with the gay community over the years. So if there's 1,000 in Chicago's history, I know there's tens of thousands across the country. But I have not stumbled across anything yet quite like what you're doing with MilWALKee. Are there other LGBT walking tour apps out there and I just haven't heard about them? Or are you the first? Are you kind of the pioneer of a new concept of walking tour apps?
I don't believe we are the first. I know that New York and Chicago jointly have one that you could download. It's called Vamond, and then you're able to look up sites in New York and Chicago. There may have been one place, I don't know, long way of saying, I don't believe that we are the first, but, because also lots of places have walking tours. But what was really important to me with this one is that it be really distinctly MilWALKee, if that makes sense. That we wanted to create one that very much just reflects our city and our history, which I think is inevitably going to happen when you put together a team of locals. And the thing with our history too, right, is that places like New York and Chicago, they may have more sites that people across the country are familiar with. So the sites themselves often can lend to being identified as historically significant. In doing our app, it was a matter of looking both at the physical sites themselves, but also using the sites as a means to help to tell our local stories, and then also to be able to put them into a broader context. It's hard to say if ours is the first, but it's definitely the best.
And it's designed as a walking tour app. In other words, it's kind of like what you would get when you go into the Museum of Natural History and it walks you through the exhibits. It's the same way with yours, correct? I mean, if I started it, I could start on a walking path and pass the places in the order that they were presented to me in the app and learn about them. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Just as if I had an actual tour guide, except it's virtual.
Right. So the way that it works is you pull up you download the app for free, again, for free. So everybody could download this if they want to check it out. And so it opens up. The loading page is where we included our corporate sponsors. And I felt that was really important to do, not only because it's good manners to thank people for helping to support your work, but also to be able to show people, to show users who some of our present day supporters are, who some of our leaders in LGBTQ equity are here. So you get to see them on our loading page, and then it opens into a map of the city. And I wanted to start with a map of the city that includes all of our points on it. So the second you open the app, you can see that we have made our mark on the city. You can see that there are, 25 sites that at this point we've begun with. So you could see all of them on the map. And this was a really important thing to me, and a big reason why I wanted to do this project is because so much of our history has been erased. And the idea actually started for me when we were commemorating the Black Nite, the 60th anniversary of the Black Nite Brawl last August. And we were just standing in the empty lot where it had once been. And our mayor was commenting upon how he lived in the city his whole life. He went by this lot every day and he had no idea about the history. So I was wanting to ensure that we'd had a way that people could see that we have left our mark here in the city, and ways in which so that was the first step. And that's what you see then when the app loads. So you see the map of our city, and then you can either pick pick to view the sites and visit them by tour, or else just as individual sites. And if you click on one of the tours, then it'll show you the sites for that particular tour. And then they've got them all on the map. Then you could either see a listing of them or just view them from the different points. You are given directions how to get to these different locations. And then for each of the sites, when you click on it, that's when you then get to view the multimedia. That's when the mini documentary comes up. And actually, our narrator, Amy, has some friends in New York who actually took advantage of the all-weather component of our app. They're living in New York, and apparently they just binge watched all of these mini documentaries one day, and they loved it. They thought it was fantastic.
So, despite the fact that I live in warm, sunny Florida and have never, ever, ever set foot in the state of Wisconsin, I could open your app and take a virtual tour of the places that you've documented, the 25 sites on your MilWALKee tour, and learn about them and see pictures of them and actually kind of feel like I've had some experience in Milwaukee's LGBT history.
Absolutely. Yes. And I feel like we've done a good job of not only capturing and sharing Milwaukee's LGBTQ history, but also in telling just more universal stories of LGBTQ people and also just, being people in general.
So you mentioned the Black Nite, which I've been familiar with, and Michael and I have spoken about it before. But I know there's another site that has, you were mentioning that Milwaukee has a long history, not only with the LGBT community in general, but specifically in recording some of that history and documenting some of the older examples of LGBT spaces that existed in Milwaukee. And I know from my research, there are very few what we used to call gay spaces that were documented anywhere in the country before 1900. That's just almost unheard of. There's a couple that we know of. There's one in Texas that I'm aware of. I believe it was called the Wagon Wheel. There's FAFS, which is in New York City, that we have pretty decent documentation of. And then we also have Blunts. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
I think, this is one of my very favorite sites. So it's Blunt's Saloon here in Milwaukee. And the reason, so the reason we've got Blunt's Saloon on our app is because a guy by the name of Frank Blunt made headlines back in 1893 because he'd been arrested for stealing money from a family. He was supposedly staying there invited, but it turns out he was not invited and he ran off with some of their money. So he made headlines, and not just because he was arrested, but because during the course of his arrest, it was discovered that he had been assigned female at birth. And Frank actually owned a saloon with his friend who he basically adopted as a father figure, an old Civil War veteran, and they opened this saloon together. So, and the saloon became a place where Frank was, free to gamble and drink and, do all the things he felt comfortable doing. So in some ways he was able to create his own space in which to exist. But it's just a remarkable story. There's so many trans people throughout history who we only know about because they went afoul of the law in some way, or else upon death it was discovered that they were really, this is like the language of the day. It's suddenly become sensationalized that they were trans and that no one knew throughout their lifetimes. so it was really exciting to be able to share Frank's story, to be able to help show people that the trans folks have always been around in the ways in which we have left our mark as well.
Well, and this, just as a reminder, I don't know if you mentioned it, but we're talking here in the late 1800s, like 1885, 1890 is when this was going down. So this isn't something that, happened after World War II. We're talking about something that happened, in the 1890s. And there were no, I'm guessing, there were no treatments for someone to go through a process of transitioning. There were no hormone treatments and implants and all this kind of stuff being done. More than likely, I'm guessing that Frank just basically dressed and presented himself as a male and fooled a lot of people.
Yes, and he apparently is quite the womanizer.
So I've heard.
Yeah.
Quite scandalous too. From what I've heard through your app and a little bit of other research I've done, Frank was quite the hooligan. A little bit of a troublemaker, a gambler, a drinker, a womanizer. Not some dainty little sissy boy kind of feminine guy. He was actually fully out there, and this goes back well over 100 years in Milwaukee. So we're talking about a pretty revolutionary concept back then. And the bar itself, just to be clear, nothing that I've seen gave any indication that the bar itself was technically anything that we would put under the umbrella of an LGBTQ bar. It just happened to be that the owner used it for his own nefarious purposes and was, himself a member of the community.
That's right. What I find really interesting, though, is its location. And you're right. The story, when we first meet Frank, or when these newspaper articles were published, it was in 1893. And what I find fascinating is that the location of Blunt's Saloon was right next door, in the adjoining, so in the actual same building, it's right next door to a space that, in my opinion, is one of, if not the most physically significant historical sites here in Milwaukee, because it was home to LGBTQ bars for 50 years. Of course, this came much later. Like in the 60s was when it first opened at the time as a women's bar, actually, as a lesbian bar. And then it stayed open. It went through several name changes, but again, just had several different bars there. And it was right next door to Blunt's Saloon. So there's just something magical about that corner here in Milwaukee that, I don't know, if I won the lottery, I think I'd buy the building and want to turn it into a museum.
Now, like a lot of other cities that I've researched and heard about, they tend to have what we now call gayborhoods. And Milwaukee kind of had that too, right? There were a couple of distinct areas downtown that were known over decades for repeatedly having gay bars again and again and again. It wasn't like they were scattered all over town. They seemed to be somewhat concentrated. Was that the case that you found that when you were doing your walking tour project?
Yes. For the most part, the bars were within, pretty close to each other around downtown in a couple of different neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods shifted, depending upon the economic and political situation at the time as to whether or not they had predominantly LGBTQ bars. But I would agree, it was for the most part around downtown.
And from what I understand, highway projects and government acquisition of buildings had to do with that as well.
Sure, always the most rundown places, just as I'm sure you found in your research, that those are the places that they could operate.
Well, did you find, I know when I was looking into the bar scene, even when I'm a good bit older than you, I first went out to my very first gay bar in 1978. So I've had, some extended familiarity with the gay bar scene on the East Coast, mostly of the U.S. And back then, in the 70s and 80s, in general, the bars tended to be more discreet. They had entrances that were not necessarily particularly noticeable on the front, on the street side of the building. They didn't have big signs. They didn't have wide open windows that you could see in. They were kind of like an underground bar almost. Is that the case in Milwaukee as well, that you found when you're researching these bars?
Yeah, so some of the earlier ones for sure. Yes, and I would say I think our first bar, the M&M Club, that was the first bar to actually have open windows facing the street, and that was in the mid '80s, I believe, 1984. That was the first time that there were these open windows. So yeah, very similar.
Yeah, I've seen pictures. I'll put one up actually of what that building looked like, and the kind of logo and everything they used, and it looks like it was a pretty big deal. Like when the M&M opened, it must have been the talk of the town for a good while, I would imagine.
Yeah, it had a good long life here too. It was definitely a very beloved bar, and it's the only one that has regular reunions, even though it closed over, gosh, a decade ago. I'm trying to remember exactly how many years. There's still reunions.
Yeah, other cities have some bars like that too that were just iconic. And fortunately, we live in a time now where a lot of these places are getting recognition. I don't know if you're familiar, how familiar you are with the bar scene in general, but there was a big bar. It was the predecessor, actually, to Studio 54. Studio 54, everybody knows. Limelight, everybody knows. They were in New York. But actually, before Studio 54 was ever dreamt of, there was a bar in Los Angeles called Studio One. And supposedly that's where they got the idea for Studio 54, was when they came out to LA and saw this fabulous bar and said, hey, we should do this in New York. And Studio 54 followed. But fortunately, at this time, there are like movies, mini documentaries, all kinds of things being made, and books being written to document these kind of parts of our history that have been lost for so long. And just like you're documenting the impacts of the places downtown, the physical spaces, we're seeing that across the board, which is really exciting to me.
Yeah, you've dedicated so much of your life to helping to save this history that I'm glad that others are valuing the importance of this work. I agree.
So did the Milwaukee bar scene have much of an impact on you personally?
I would say it did. It did to some extent in understanding my identity. Similar to how I found myself through Lou's story. But before transitioning, I identified as lesbian and then queer more accurately. And actually, I helped to start a drag king troupe here in Milwaukee called the Miltown Kings. It's actually still around. We started it back in 2004. And we did our first shows here in local bars, actually in Walker's Pint, which is one of the oldest remaining women's bars or lesbian bars that's still open in the nation. And so we did our first show there, and then our early shows at another bar called Dish that had been several different bars. That location been a number of different bars over the years. And it was great. I found through performing drag that it was, I realized that unlike some of the other performers, that when I stepped off stage, I didn't really feel any differently. What I mean by that is that a lot of the performers, they would adopt certain personas as they're performing drag,
Right.
as they're, the getting all dressed up and then, really enacting and embodying this persona. Whereas for me, I very much felt like the same person on stage as off. And yet it was so incredible to have the validation of the crowd, to have people just really validating my masculinity, that, yeah, it was an important piece of the puzzle in coming to understand my identity as well.
And again, we're talking about something that's less than 20 years ago. You're talking about the early 2000s when you were starting this process, navigating the transition, right?
Right. Yeah. And I first began physically transitioning in 2008.
Okay. The reason I bring that up is because I'm trying to put it in context to the fact that, a lot of people say, oh, we don't need gay bars now. We don't need lesbian spaces. We don't need queer bars, whatever. We can go wherever we want. But we still, and you're a perfect example of this, we still need those places to affirm our identities and help us evolve with people that understand what's going on in our head and what we're feeling and thinking, because you're not going to get that by going to Applebee's. I mean, you know what I mean? You have to be around like-minded people who are at least in tune with that process. It doesn't mean you can't go to Applebee's, but it does mean that you need a home somewhere that you can kind of bounce these ideas off of and learn more about, what your community is like and what you're experiencing, and understand it. So I'm glad to see, because I know it was that way for me in the 70s. That's really what kind of helped me to understand where I was headed. And I'm glad to see that, 30 years later, it still had the same impact in your life.
For sure. And I just, our community bars have always been more than bars, right? They're civic institutions. I mean, they've always just done so much for us rather than serve drinks, first as being a place of refuge, but then also, if you think about how many bars did fundraisers during the AIDS crisis.
Oh, absolutely.
To try and help address that. And even before that, anytime someone needed help finding a job or maybe needed a meal, that oftentimes they could find them in these bars too, that there was just so much more that they offered, that they have offered, and that they continue to offer as well. And there's a reason why so many allies like to go to our bars. They're cool. They're a lot of fun.
And in the disco age, we had the best music and the best performers and the best light shows. I think the disco age is what really kind of put the gay scene, the nightlife scene, on the map for a lot of people. It was in the late 70s, throughout the 80s, when we were still winding down that whole, dance bar concept. That really opened a lot of people's eyes to, hey, I've heard so many cool things about this place. I need to go there. And then once they go there and they meet 5, 6, 10 people that are, identifying as queer, they suddenly realize that, they're not some kind of strange alien beast. They're people that they can actually get along with and respect their opinions, and made a big difference in where our community has gone over the decades.
Agreed.
There was a woman, I lived in Atlanta for quite a while in the 80s and 90s. And there was a lesbian there who operated a lesbian bar at first. And then she kind of evolved into a country Western motif. And she had 3 country Western bars in succession in Atlanta over the course of, 20 or 30 years. And her name was Dina Collins. But to what you were saying just a minute ago, her tagline for Dina's One Mo Time, which was her first country Western anybody's welcome bar, was a bar with a sense of community. And she was so dedicated, and this is, in the late 80s, she was so dedicated to supporting people who were living with HIV and having difficulty because they were being thrown out because they were gay, that in the early years of that bar, many nights she used to sleep in her own office in the bar. After they closed up at 3 o'clock in the morning and wound everything down at 4:30, 5 o'clock, when she could get a little bit of rest, she'd lay down and take a nap so that she could be awake at 7 or 7:30 in the morning and open the doors of her bar. So these younger LGBT people who were out on the streets could come in and take a shower and get a breakfast and have, a start to their day. And that's something we don't see in the bar scene anymore, gay, straight, or otherwise. But back then, and she was a lesbian. She wasn't even, a gay man looking out for other gay men. This is a lesbian who just took them under her wing, and everybody called her mama. And Dina she's still around. One of these days I'll interview her. She's, I think, 86 years old now. And I'm going to have to travel to Atlanta to interview her in person because the technology thing, not so much working for her right now.
Yeah.
But
what a treasure. Yes, I really hope you're able to capture her story. These were a lot of the types of stories that we told on our app too, is, just why the bars were so much more than just bars, and who some of these incredible people were who helped to care for the communities. For example, a bar called C'est La Vie, a guy worked in a factory for 25 years, saving up money to be able to buy this, and bought the space above it as a rooming house so that young gay men would have a safe place to stay. Another bar called Your Place, where so many, and this was an earlier gay bar in the 60s, where so many patrons could find a family because the bar owner's parents had helped to buy the bar for him and his partner, and they were such an integral part of the bar itself. Where all these young gay men were able to feel like they had parents who loved them and accepted them and cared for them. And just so many of these stories. Bars are just treasures.
Well, I certainly appreciate what you've done and the fact that you've created this app that people in Milwaukee can, on their spare time, either as tourists or local residents, can just pop it up and take a stroll through that part of downtown and learn about their gay history. Or those of us who live in South Florida or California or Maine can learn something about, the gay history of Wisconsin. And as we mentioned earlier, Michael Takash and Don Schwab have done a great job with the Milwaukee or Wisconsin LGBT History Project. There's a book that just came out that Michael and BJ Daniels wrote about the history of drag in Milwaukee. Michael's got a book out called LGBT Milwaukee. So y'all in Milwaukee are kicking some butt. You're doing a great job of recording everything there is to record about Wisconsin's gay history. So, hats off to you. It's a great thing.
Well, thank you. And something that I love too is how supportive we are of one another's work. That we very much, we're all about cooperation, not competition, which is a very Milwaukee thing too. That we're also service oriented and community oriented, and that we're able to see that when you help each other out, everybody wins. It's only to your advantage to help out. And we're very excited with the app. For starters, our initial list was 100 locations. So we were only able to launch with 25 based on how much we're able to raise at that point. So there are many more sites that we're looking forward to adding. And there are actually two that we hope to add in October to correspond with LGBTQ History Month. And one of the tours is going to be all brand new research that I'll be excited to share with you because they are from the sites are some of our old, specifically Black LGBTQ bars that were active in the 80s and 90s. And we're bringing on a new researcher to join us, Janice Colby, who is a really well-known performer in these bars. And we're working really hard to document all of their stories partnering up with different colleges in the area to do additional spin-off projects to ensure that we're recording their stories, this history, and memorializing and giving folks the honors that they're due.
Yeah, and speaking to your point of being very supportive and cooperative, I interviewed Michael probably a year ago. I think that was the first segment I did on anything in Milwaukee or Wisconsin, for that matter. And he has connected me with numerous people. He's been a great advocate of my project. He is the one that actually physically introduced me to BJ Daniels to do BJ's video, which I just released today. So it's on my YouTube channel, and it's on our Facebook page, our group page. He connected me with Marshall Shore, who is a historian out of Phoenix, with George Snyder, who is the owner of the This Is It bar, and Will Fellows. So, and yourself, he's the way I got in touch with you. So I never would have found you. I mean, where am I going to find all these people in Milwaukee when I've never been there without, the cooperation of other people who have encountered you? And it's great. That's the way it should be. I want to invite you, if you're not already a member of the Facebook group I started, which is called GayBarchives, definitely you want to join. It's about not quite a year and a half old, and we've got about 5,500 active members. So, great. And it's the whole page, the whole group is about nothing but gay bar history and entertainment history, gay entertainment history. I don't have people up there posting ads for, shorts or tank tops or just random things. It's all about talking about the bars you remember, the experiences you had, all this kind of stuff. And you're welcome to post little snippets from your video clips out of your app, or to mention your app, because it's all about gay bar history and gay venue history in Milwaukee. So use it, to your advantage too, because that's what it's there for. And you'll find that people will come out of the woodwork. You'll post something and somebody will say, oh, well, I was there on that day in January 1968 when, this crazy person in a clown costume came in and tried to burn the place down. And you've never heard that story because it never made the news or it was never documented. So I've learned a lot of interesting things about a lot of clubs around the country from just that exact way. People posting pictures of them. Here's me in drag on Turnabout Day in 1983 at the Copa in Key West. And I'm like, okay, that picture's probably never been seen before. But, that's what we're here for. Let's all work together. I will put a link on my website, thegaybarchives.com. I have a page called Archives. And on the Archives page, I have a listing by state of all of the LGBT resources online that I've been able to find. So you go to the particular state you're looking for, and I'll put a link to your MilWALKee app so people can find it. And there's links to the MKE LGBT history.org website and whatever. Because that's another problem that I'm sure you had when you were researching, is that there's no place where all of these resources are listed. You have to almost go door to door and ask people, do you know somewhere where I can find out about, gay history? So I'm trying to consolidate that, and I'll certainly put your list on your website on there as well.
Oh, thank you. That's fantastic. I love the sense of community. And another site that I would encourage you to check out on our app, because there is a Florida connection. So be sure to check out the mini documentary about Club La Tosca.
La Tosca?
Yep, Club La Tosca.
Okay, I will definitely look at that. Where was that?
Oh, it was here in Milwaukee. It was in our Third Ward neighborhood. The story takes place right after the repeal of Prohibition. but Florida ties into it because it's about one of the first international drag performers who really made her start here in Milwaukee, but ended up retiring down to Florida.
Oh, okay, great. I will
But
definitely look into that.
Yeah, it's a fantastic, a very compelling story. Very compelling.
And I appreciate you taking the time to tell us about your app and your book and your projects in Milwaukee, and wish you the best of luck. We hope to hear lots from you in the GayBarchives Facebook group as well. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And thanks for doing all this great work, Art.
Oh, you're welcome.
That concludes another episode of the GayBarchives Show. For more information about this episode or to find more episodes, visit GayBarchives.com.